not starting it. Okay, now.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the SNAP office, and with us today we have Pam Spees from the Center for Constitutional Rights, Megan Peterson, SNAP leader in New York City, and then myself, Barbara Blaine, at the SNAP office in Chicago. And if everyone's ready, we're going to begin. Is Pam and Katie there?
Are we ready?
Yeah, okay. So today it's a really great day for victims and for children across the globe. The second time in a few months, an independent panel at the United Nations has done an investigation into the response of Catholic Church officials to sex crimes committed by church employees. And a committee at the United Nations, the Committee Against Torture, has today issued its findings and a report with recommendations after their lengthy investigation into Vatican policies and Vatican procedures and the Vatican officials themselves answering questions and also refusing to answer many of the questions. And I think that what's really important today is that that an independent panel has determined that the church officials are not doing what they should be doing, and the church officials are basically saying one thing and doing another. And we're grateful that the UN panel isn't buying what the Vatican is selling. Basically, the Vatican officials came into the investigation and tried to claim to the committee that somehow Vatican officials did not have authority over bishops and church officials across the globe, that they only had authority over the Vatican city-state. And we know that's absurd. Of course, the Pope and Vatican runs the church. Our church is hierarchical. And so the committee did not accept the findings or those statements by church officials and pointed out that they did not determine that they determined that that just was not true, and that they determined that the church officials do in fact have authority, and that they're not using their authority to do what they've committed to, which is to live up to the protocols in the Convention Against Torture that they adopted. Now, at this point, our attorney, the lead attorney on our case, is Pam Spees from the Center for Constitutional Rights, and SNAP and CCR have been working together for several years in trying to call attention to the problems within the Catholic Church, and more importantly, to try to foster some change from the top down. And we initially worked together to take a case to the International Criminal Court, and we did that in 2011, and things kept growing as we did that. Many more victims, some of you, came forward and told about your experiences, and with more information we were able to take it to new levels. And we were really grateful that human rights officials across the globe took notice, and they began communicating amongst themselves. And then what happened is that the human rights officials in the United Nations decided to call the Vatican officials in for an accounting. And so this is the second committee this year that has looked at into the Vatican, and the report comes out today, and basically it says that they have fallen short. And we are grateful to Pam Spees from the Center for Constitutional Rights, and she's going to explain now her take on the findings. Thanks, Pam.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you
For those of you who've joined us, it is an important day. As Barbara said, this is the second UN panel that has looked at the issue of widespread sexual violence within the church. This was today the Committee Against Torture that issued its findings, and the Vatican ratified the Convention Against Torture in 2002. And for the most part, it, as well as I think many people in the international community, thought that that ratification was mostly symbolic. Well, we know the Vatican did not seriously believe it would be held accountable to the same standards as other states that have ratified these treaties. But now what we're seeing that it is actually being held to the same standards, which is something that has never happened before, or before January, when the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child first called the Vatican for questioning under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So what we've seen, I think, is a really important shift where secular authorities, international authorities, are actually pulling the Vatican to the table and asking some very tough questions. And then they've made findings based on their inquiries and what they've seen and what we've been able to show them, as well as other groups have brought to their attention, in terms of both the fact of the widespread sexual violence and the fact of the Vatican policies and practices that enable it and cover it up and basically help to perpetuate it. The committee's findings today were important because this is a world body that is comprised of experts in international law and experts on torture. And they have looked at this very carefully and have addressed the widespread sexual violence as forms of torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And just so you know, we've gotten a lot of questions about that. And this committee and other international law bodies for years have recognized that rape and other forms of sexual violence can and do constitute torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And torture is defined basically as an act that causes severe pain and suffering when it's done by a public official or at the instigation or with the acquiescence of a public official. And so the fact that this committee has seen it within its purview to address these crimes and these acts as forms of torture is very significant. One of the hallmarks of torture is the severity of the harm that results from the acts. And one of the things we tried to surface in our reporting, and the committee was very clear about, is the lifelong and often life-threatening nature of the harm that results from these types of acts, especially when they're committed against children, and especially under the veil of religious authority, and what that does to people over a lifetime. And we surfaced, the fact that sometimes people do not survive their experiences. There have been commissions of inquiry in Australia and in Belgium, and there have been investigations in the U.S. which have shown the number of suicides that have been linked to these acts. And it can't be overstated, the harm. And so we're grateful that the committee took this up. We know that the church has been minimizing the harm, has been obfuscating and trying to keep the waters very murky. But this is a very clear statement from the world body that's tasked with overseeing this that says it is unequivocally these can amount to forms of torture and cruel treatment, and that it should be taken that seriously. The other thing, as Barbara said, that's really significant is when you think about the pressure that the Vatican was bringing even before the questioning started. One of the things that they were doing was they were actually trying to warn the committee that it should not ask questions about the sexual violence within the church. And they were trying to suggest that if it did, that there might be bias involved. Clearly, the committee did not shy away from its job. It bore down and it asked the right questions, the tough questions. And now we have a series of findings where they are talking throughout this report, every aspect of the convention, they expressed serious concerns about the fact of the sexual violence and the way the Vatican has dealt with it or not dealt with it. I would say they've dealt with it in ways that ensured it would continue. So we have a series of recommendations now moving forward. They've insisted that the Vatican answer within the year about what they're doing to implement those recommendations. There's something now to by which to judge. There are some standards there now that advocates and survivors can use, and additional tools to hold the Vatican accountable. There's lots more I'd love to say. I'll pause there. I am here with Megan Peterson, who was in Geneva, and actually her case was mentioned in the report that was released today in the committee's findings. We're surrounded by her art here, and in fact the piece right behind us is something we used on the cover of the report we submitted to this committee because we wanted to communicate right away what we're talking about and the kind of devastating harm that can result and so often results. So I'll pause there and see if Megan has any thoughts about the events of the day.
Thank you everybody for joining. I was very, very pleased today with the report that the Committee Against Torture released to the Vatican. It's just been a real surreal day for me, seeing my own abuser's name mentioned in the report and not only knowing that he's my abuser, but you could insert so many different priests within that. And it really feels like a step forward. The community is taking it very seriously, that rape and sexual violence are indeed acts of torture. So I was very hopeful in the report today, and I'm hopeful that this is going to keep pointing us in the right directions in the future.
Yeah, and I think one of our SNAP leaders who was in Geneva today, Miguel Hurtado, who was abused in Spain but now lives in London, he was in Geneva. He has met with the committee previously, and he issued a statement today pointing out how sad it is that here we are in 2014 and that this independent body is in the position to be telling church officials to remove sexual predators from ministry. And that one more time, that how sad it is that the church even needs to be told that. You would think that would be clear and obvious. Another thing that that Miguel talked about was that that with all the hundreds of thousands of children's lives that have been shattered, because the Catholic Church officials ignored and covered up sex crimes, it's striking that they still claim that they don't have or won't share real numbers on this crisis, and that it takes like this independent panel to now be telling church officials, well, it's time to start counting and sharing at least the basic information about these horrific violations. And I wonder, as one of the victims, how many of our stories the Vatican holds. I mean, so many of us did report our experiences to church officials, and what did they do with that information? Like, why don't they have it to turn over to the United Nations when the United Nations asked for it? Okay, but those are some of Miguel's thoughts, and he has many more. And if he's able, he'll try to join us. He was traveling and was not able to join us in person, but he did send his report. And if you're interested, it's actually posted on our website. But I know many of you have sent questions in, and so if it's okay with Pam and Meg, we'll go ahead and start addressing the questions that have come in. Is that okay with you two?
That's fine here.
Okay, so one of the questions that was asked is can the committee punish officials in any way? And what will happen if once again next year the Vatican officials miss the reporting date? I don't know, Pam, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. So this is a monitoring body. It's not a prosecutorial body, if you will, and its primary function is to monitor what's going on, to identify what the problems are, to set standards for adhering to the convention. And what happens is that it creates a dialogue, and it is a way for people who have a stake in these matters to engage with an independent body. So, SNAP and CCR filed a report. Barbara and Megan were in Geneva and got to speak to the committee. There's a way that you can bring your voices into this process. And so it's through that process of dialogue and monitoring that the committee operates. So it can't hold individual officials accountable. It can certainly identify, where the problems are. But in terms of prosecuting or any sort of punishment that it can meet, it doesn't have that power. But what can happen is that the committee's findings, the committee's reports, can be used in other settings. It can be used at the national level, for instance, to push for that these investigations or commissions be set up or undertaken to address the issue, especially if it's seen to have the weight of the problem that it clearly does, which is torture. And which is being equated with torture, which is often dealt with in a different way in our national systems, right? So,
Megan, you want to add anything to that one?
I'm good.
I would say, if I can, Barbara, there's one thing I want to point out about the events of today, if it's okay, unless you have other questions you want to.
No, please.
So one of the things that happened first thing this morning, so the committee released its report at 2 p.m. in Geneva, and it released the reporting via a press conference, and but somehow the Vatican about 7 hours before that went live basically with the report and started putting out a narrative about that report that somehow suggested it was not, that the committee did not find that it had been in violation of the convention, and which was very strange because we see the report and it very clearly sets that out. And the committee members themselves were asked about that at the press conference, and they said very clearly that they saw that the Vatican was in violation of the convention. They said very clearly that rape and sexual violence can and do often amount to torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And they said very clearly that the Vatican's responsibility extends beyond Vatican City State. And they were very adamant about that. And if you can, I encourage you to listen to that press conference. We can post a link. We have posted links on our websites and Facebook pages if you're interested in that. But if you see any sort of reporting that has this messaging from the Vatican that somehow it was the committee did not take this seriously and did not find it basically in violation, that's just clearly wrong.
Yeah, I think that's really important because it's striking how the church officials are claiming something completely opposite of what the report says, right, and trying to redefine what's in the report. It's interesting. One of the committee members, I think, the rapporteur, who is Felice Gare, she actually said that she said, you have the answers in front of you. We made this finding in the report, and you have 8 pages. So how can can you say that? So they were pretty, the committee members were pretty blunt in pointing out that they contradicted the assessment by the Vatican officials.
Right.
And considering that they're the ones who wrote the report, it's clear that that they know what they said, and anyone can read the report. We have it, well, SNAP and CCR, I think we both have it posted on our websites, and it's on the UN website as well. If it's okay with everyone, we'll go to another question.
Sure.
This one comes from Ohio. The question is, has the Bishop of Rome, who I think we all know that means the Pope, shown any sincere promise of holding local bishops accountable for their actions? And he specifically questions about the situation with the Archdiocese of Minneapolis-St. Paul, and he also adds, do we think that the Vatican under Pope Francis has been any different than the last two popes in investigating their bishops? Pam, do you want to answer the first part, and I'll answer the second part of the question?
Sure. What we have said, and what SNAP has said for a long time, and what we have said to both the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Committee Against Torture is that one of the things that has never been done and has never changed throughout all of the scandals in different countries is the fact that the Vatican appears to have no political will, and has made no changes that would require compliance and adherence to so-called zero-tolerance policies on the part of bishops and cardinals. And we know that much of the problem lay with the bishops and cardinals, that they are the ones who are often protecting those who've perpetrated these types of acts. We know that they're the ones who are shifting priests around and making decisions about that, and often minimizing and causing more harm to victims. So, you know, the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Committee Against Torture asked the Vatican very tough questions about that. You know, they can talk about zero-tolerance policies, so-called zero-tolerance policies, but what investigations have shown is that the same things are still happening behind those policies and behind the veil of these reforms. And yet we've never seen a bishop or a cardinal held accountable for having covered up and having exposed others to more harm and to rape and sexual violence. So until that happens, you know, there is no change. And so we've not seen anything or really heard anything clearly about any intentions along those lines. Barbara, I'll let you answer the second part of that.
Well, and maybe Pam touched on it, but the second part of the question was whether or not the Vatican under Pope Francis has been any different than the previous two popes in investigating the bishops. And I think that we should judge Pope Francis on his actions, not on what he says. And if we look carefully at the actions of Pope Francis, we'll see that there's really nothing different. While he makes lofty statements and says that he's and even sets up a commission, I think it's really important to recognize that we cannot mistake a commission for action, because the commission is, and even setting the commission up, in a sense, it's a little deceitful, because it gives the impression that if Pope Francis just had a bit more information, he would do the right thing. But in fact, we know he has all the information he needs to do the right thing. Everyone knows if there is a child and an adult and there's sexual anything happening, that it's a crime. Police should be called, pure and simple. And to claim that they're going to have a commission study this, what's so interesting is that that we in SNAP have seen, and we've even been part of some of these panels to discuss and to assess and to establish new policies, you know, like lay review boards and commissions and committees that are set up by dioceses or religious communities, or even the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. We've met with a lot of them, and some SNAP leaders have been part of them. And yet, at the end of the day, if we look, they really have not been effective in bringing about any substantive change. And so, when there's a committee set up and investigations or studies done, it gives an impression that there's activity. But setting up a commission won't protect children. The type of action that we think would protect kids would be if Pope Francis were to follow the recommendations of the 2 UN committees now. And, for example, release the identities of the sexual predators and tell what's happened to the perpetrators. Where are they today? What are they doing? Where do they live? So that people can be warned about their history. They don't tell us how many victims there are. They don't provide information that would assist parents in protecting kids today. Another thing that would show that Pope Francis was sincere would be if he really worked to create an environment in our church where victims felt safe to speak up, and where parishioners were encouraged that it's their Christian and civic duty to report information to the police. In fact, the climate in most churches, in most dioceses, is such that victims are afraid to speak up, and we think they have reason to be afraid. If someone is an employee in a parish or in a diocesan or a Catholic institution, if that person reports his or her abuse or speaks out, they have a good reason to fear that they might lose their jobs, because that's what happens. And I think if Pope Francis were sincere, he would be rewarding the whistleblowers and hold them out as heroes, because that's what they are. I mean, it takes so much courage to report sexual abuse, especially by a priest. And priests are put on such a pedestal that it's really difficult and painful for anyone to report these crimes. And so, no one wants to, create waves or cause problems. And somehow, if we tell about sexual abuse, we're creating a problem. But in fact, obviously, the reality is that when we tell, we're exposing evil. And when that evil is exposed, we can begin to address it and stop it and overturn it and reform it. And that's what I think is lacking, is that Pope Francis has not created that environment where people will feel safe to speak up and come forward. And the last thing that's so important that we haven't seen is we have not seen Pope Francis or any pope punish the bishops who have covered up these sex crimes and who have transferred the predators and enabled our perpetrators. So many of us, most of us, would never have had our innocence shattered had church officials done the right thing. And we know that the numbers of victims it's in the hundreds of thousands that could have been saved if the church officials just did the right thing. And that's pretty much, I think, what the committee is asking of church officials today. So we'll go to the next question, okay? The next question is that there was something in the report talking about establishing an independent complaint mechanism where victims can confidentially report their allegations of abuse. And the question is whether or not even a well-intentioned committee that's set up by the church can actually be independent. And is there any way that the UN itself could require funding for this type of an independent commission, so that the complaints could be tracked and compiled and the information could be made public. And I think it's a great question. Pam, do you want to try to answer this one?
Sure. So the question is targeted to the recommendation for the independent complaint mechanism. The question is, will there be funding, or I'm sorry, can you just repeat that?
Okay. First of all, one of the recommendations in the report today is that that there be an independent complaint mechanism put in place where victims can feel safe to report confidentially what happened to them. And so the question, the person asking the question is saying, how can it really be independent if it's run by the church? And could the UN basically set up the commission rather than the Catholic Church, because that way, or could the UN oversee it so that the complaints that are made throughout the world could be tracked and compiled and, you know, maybe responded to?
There are different models of commissions that have been set up to address really massive human rights violations. We have models like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The most sort of well-known one is the one in South Africa. There are similar models of such commissions in Guatemala, for instance, and in other places. And oftentimes the UN has been involved in some of these hybrid transitional sort of justice mechanisms. I don't think it's too far-fetched to think that one could see some mechanism like this being set up. Clearly, it would have to be independent of the Vatican. We know that. We know that independent review boards haven't been able to function the way they were promised that they would. We have whistleblowers from some of those, and we also have a grand jury investigation which shows over and over again that in Philly that the Philadelphia Archdiocese was functioning in accordance, and was given a bill of good health from the independent review board, and then there were 37 credibly accused priests functioning. So it's clear it needs to be independent of the Vatican. But I think that there are opportunities that are opening up now that we have international mechanisms, these expert bodies looking at this, building pressure, identifying and agreeing with what survivors have been saying for some time, which is that the Vatican can't police itself. It's not doing it, and it can't be trusted to do it. So I think you could see the potential for a possibility of some type of mechanism like that opening up, and I hope that survivors and advocates will, if that opportunity really does present itself, be at the forefront of pushing what that should look like and what it should do.
Okay, so we're getting a lot of questions coming in, so I'm thinking that if we're going to be able to address more, we'll have to try to make our answers shorter, but there's so many.
Noted.
Okay, here's a couple more. This is someone that says, I am new to SNAP. This is the first I've been involved, and I want to know, how do I report my abuse? I want to be counted. Where do I go? I think that's a really tough question, and I think that points to the problems that we have. And I really welcome the new survivor who just contacted SNAP. It takes lots of courage, and I invite you to get involved in your local area and know that that it matters that you do speak up. In terms of where to report, I think it clearly, if you haven't yet, you should consider going to the police and telling police in your area. And you don't need to go alone. You can certainly contact, have SNAP members and supporters go with you. And maybe we can talk, if you want to send me an email, we can talk about your situation and see if that's something that could be taken to, could be included in any kind of a report to the United Nations or to the International Criminal Court? It's a very good question. So many of us feel that way, that our cases have never been counted. Did you want to add anything, Pam?
No, I think you said everything.
Okay, the next question is, how do victims who have been tortured seek justice, and is there a definition of what is torture?
So, you know, normally if depending on how recent or how old your case is, you would, you know, you would bring a complaint domestically, and in many countries, and I'm not sure where this question is coming from, but in many countries, you know, torture is included in the domestic law. There are oftentimes the possibilities for civil redress, civil cases to be brought, and it just depends on where you are. The definition of torture is and this is all set out in our reporting, which are on both the SNAP and CCR websites, but the definition of torture is any act which causes severe pain and suffering, including both mental and physical harm, when it's committed by or at the instigation of a public official, or with the acquiescence of a public official, and generally for purposes such as coercion, intimidation, or if there's discrimination involved, or that sort of thing. So that's the definition, and depending on a case, an individual case, it could meet all of that, and should be viewed as that, and investigated as such. Trying to keep my answer short, Barbara.
Thank you. When can we expect to see changes in the way the church handles these cases? And what will happen if Vatican officials do nothing and make no changes?
Barbara, I think you're best placed to answer that. You've been dealing with it for 25 years. So.
Okay, so I believe that we have to remain hopeful. And the reason I say that is not because I have so much faith in Pope Francis or Vatican officials, because I don't. But I do have hope because I feel like we have to, because so much is at risk. And what's at risk is children today. There are children who might not be abused if we succeed in getting church officials to do the right thing. And knowing the devastation that each of us has experienced having been sexually violated by a priest, I think that we want to do anything and everything we can to prevent one more person from having to go through what we've been through. So, you know, I just want you to know that I'm really hopeful, and I think there's reason to hope, and the reason is the faces of little children, and well, not their faces, their lives, and who they are, and who they have the potential to become. But also, I answered the first part, Pam, but I'm going to ask you to try to go with the second part, which is what will happen if the Vatican officials do nothing, if they make no changes? Will the UN do anything?
Well, the UN is, I mean, these committees are seized of the matter now. I mean, this is the days of treating the Vatican's ratification and participation in these processes as symbolic are over. The Vatican ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1990, and this was the first time it's had to show up and answer questions this year in January. Before the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and it ratified the Convention Against Torture in 2002, and it's only now that it's showing up and having to engage in this process. So these things have never happened before. The Vatican has never had to answer any questions to anyone before. So in terms of what can come from this, if the Vatican continues to do nothing, we've never seen this situation. The Vatican's never seen this situation. Now there's some oversight. There's some form of accountability, and things can't go back, and they will not go back to the way they were before, when the Vatican could just continue to be disingenuous about what it was doing, and doing these cosmetic reforms, because the world is watching now in a much different way.
Yeah, that gives me hope. It makes me feel that we have, I don't know, that things are going to continue to improve, that 2014 is, you know, marking a new era in our movement. The next question is a little more specific regarding the report, and the question is, does the report require the Vatican to make any kind of restitution for those who have been sexually violated or tortured in any way?
Do you want me to answer that, Barbara?
Yeah, if you don't mind, that'd be great.
So some of the recommendations that were contained in the report have to do with the issue of redress, with the issue of compensation, and what we call in the international sphere reparations, which includes not just monetary compensation. It includes rehabilitation, and things that are what we call guarantees of non-repetition. So the whole point of reparations being that it requires accountability. It requires that you bring about changes to ensure that these things can't happen again. And the committee set out a number of recommendations. They asked really tough questions about it, because they know, based on the investigations in different countries, based on commissions of inquiry, based on everything that we've been able to accumulate to this point, that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who've never had any form of accountability, who've never had any form of compensation or rehabilitation, and who have suffered as a result. So they're asking very tough questions about that. And that's one of the reasons I think they're also signaling the need for an independent mechanism, because they know that this needs to happen. I would like to add one thing to that, Barbara. I know I'm supposed to keep it short. But one of the things the Vatican representatives did in this setting, and they did it in the Committee on the Rights of the Child as well, is claim that they have paid out so much money, so many millions in reparations to victims, as though that's something they did voluntarily. But that's again an example of being very disingenuous, because this is something that survivors have had to fight for. They've had to bring cases. They've had to fight against church lawyers, and the victim blaming that goes along with that. All of the dynamics that come with having to fight an entity that's going to fight you every step of the way, and only pay any kind of settlement when it is absolutely forced to and sees no other option. So that's something we need to be very clear about, that when it's dropping these numbers, it's not something that it did because it recognized that it was wrong and this needed to happen. It's something it was forced to do and that survivors fought for.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing that we have to recognize is that the vast majority of victims really don't get any compensation or experience any redress. And many who have received promises that their counseling would be paid for, frequently the counseling gets cut off, or there are conditions put on the counseling. For example, they'll say, well, we'll pay for your counseling for 6 months, or we'll pay up to 3 years. Or but you have to sign a release so that we can see the medical records, and or you have to go to a therapist that we approve of, and so there's many strings attached. And so, but there are some big sums of money that have been paid to some individual survivors, but the vast majority of victims who belong to SNAP and participate in SNAP have not received any compensation, and that's very frustrating. We're getting a lot more questions. Now, I don't know what happened, but now I've got a whole list of questions that came in off of Twitter. And so just one of them is whether or not we could discuss how it is that the UN Committee on Torture made the determination that abuse meets a definition of torture. And I'm thinking that, Pam, you kind of covered that previously, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can say a little bit more about it, but it's not just the committee. It's international tribunals and other international human rights bodies have long understood rape and other forms of sexual violence to be forms of torture because of the seriousness and gravity of the harm involved and the way it happens, especially when there's acquiescence by public officials or they refuse to do anything about it.
Okay, now the next question here is about why, from Twitter, why can't the church be held accountable like the big tobacco companies? Force them to publicize the acts of torture and give information to victims where they can get an independent inquiry and help. That's a very good question. I'm not sure legally how the church could do that, and I think maybe that's something that we can investigate. I think one of the things that I've heard from attorneys is that something like the tobacco companies have a specific formula in making the cigarettes, and there's studies that show that that links cigarette smoking to the to cancer and other medical problems that people endure, and that the tobacco companies actually promoted the tobacco to earn money in spite of the fact that it harms people. So I don't know if we have a similar situation in the church where, but we should look into it. I don't know what the answer to that question is.
Well, I will say that when I was talking about reparations and international law and the international human rights standards, it also requires transparency and truth-telling, and it's called, setting the historical record and acknowledgement. And as part of that, it requires really divulging the ways in which and acknowledging the ways in which all of this has worked. So that's what would be required if there's full reparations at any point, whether it's through an independent mechanism or what have you. These treaties, both the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention Against Torture, require the countries that ratify it to also make available information about them and how complaints can be addressed and made. And so both committees made recommendations to the Vatican about making that information more widely available, so that, for instance, under the Child Rights Convention, kids know what their rights are. So that's another just example of that.
Okay, this is someone who's writing in, talking about canon law and saying that the Pope is not simply in charge of the few hundred people in the Vatican City State, which we know that's one of the things that the church officials tried to claim, but the committee didn't accept that. So the question is that does the committee and do the United Nations committee members understand that Vatican or that canon law does give the Pope power, and that the Pope can order and direct the Catholic Church throughout the whole world to comply with civil law if he wanted to, and that he could also tell them that they have to reveal the truth about clergy sex abuse crisis and to do justice for victims. What do you think, Pam?
I agree. I'm still keeping my answer short.
Okay, and I mean, I think that that I don't know whether or not the United Nations panelists understand this, this level of canon law, but we do know that the committee must have understood it, because that's what they said. Basically, is they said that they were not accepting the fact, the statements that the church officials were claiming to be powerless over the bishops across the globe. They said clear and simple that they know and they believe that the Vatican officials do have authority over bishops, and so they were just going to continue on with that.
Yeah, they were very clear. I think we've done a good job of educating them about how this operates, and the Vatican has done everything it can to distance itself from what happens outside of Vatican City State, and suggest that anything that happens outside is you know, part of its spiritual mission, and it's suggesting that it doesn't exercise that level of authority, which is clearly not the case.
Okay, we're getting near our end of time, and someone's asking whether or not the report's from the UN is going to be aired on national news tonight, and I don't think we have the answer to that. The news, it's been on the news all day today, and so I don't know. I assume it will be. It has been. It is. It's in the New York Times. It's in the Washington Post. It's on CNN. It's on Reuters. It's on the AP. So I think it's being
Europe,
covered.
Latin America. It's in different languages. It's everywhere. That's
yeah.
Yeah.
There's a special note here, a comment for Megan, saying that Megan, your artwork is even more beautiful on the wall than it was on the cover of the Shadow Report. I love the colors. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Someone else is saying that they quit their job in a parish because they spoke out, and so they're saying courage to everybody, offering courage.
That takes a lot of courage.
Yeah. Okay, so we only have 3 minutes left. Pam and Megan, do you each want to, give a 1 minute, kind of summary or last thought?
Oh, you've heard from me a lot. I'll just say thank you again for joining us and for your work and the efforts that you make in this, and we're gonna, we're very happy to be working with SNAP, and we'll just keep moving forward and doing everything we can, and it's an honor and a privilege.
I guess I'll shadow what Pam says. I would like to thank SNAP and the Center for Constitutional Rights, of course, for powering through and powering through on the behalf of the vulnerable. It's been an absolute privilege to be a part of this, and I'm very hopeful that what we're doing is going to impact future generations, so this people do not need to be in the same situation that we're in today, and I'm just very grateful to be a part of it.
And I'll just say that I take to heart the questions about where and how we're going to report, and we in SNAP leadership have been grappling with this, and we're even working on trying to begin at our upcoming conference that'll be happening the beginning of August here in Chicago this summer. We're going to begin a process of creating a space where victims will have the opportunity to report and at least make their story public, and we're going to have it recorded for anyone who wants to participate, and more details about that will be forthcoming. But I think today is a really significant and good day for our survivor movement, and we would not be here without the courage of so many of you, and for all of the survivors who have been speaking up in any which way that they could. Please know that it means something, that your story is important. Tell it. If you don't know where and you want spaces or you want to get more involved, you are welcome. We invite you to get more involved with us, and consider finding a way to get to Chicago this summer for our conference. And in the meantime, watch our website and continue to make suggestions and get involved in whatever way you can, and just know that whether you are a survivor, a loved one of a survivor, a supporter, a Catholic, a fallen away Catholic, or if you're part of any religious background, where if you've experienced violence in scouting, in sports, in schools, in any institutions, just know that your voice counts, and that you don't need to suffer alone, and we welcome you in SNAP. So thanks for participating today, and continue to make comments and leave comments on the news articles that you're seeing, and don't give up. Keep on. We're in this together. No one needs to be alone. Take care. Bye now.
Bye-bye.